This is the Depth Mystic Community Podcast. Of all the places I could start, I have to confess that I have a habit of being turned to stone. Most of this podcast is going to be devoted to an exploration of what depth mystic means. What is a depth mystic? And what is depth mysticism? But this podcast could not have come into existence if I didn't make a concession to the fact that I keep getting turned to stone. And what is it that turns me to stone? It's the fear that I'm doing this totally alone, that I'm all by myself, that there just isn't anyone capable of and willing to go to where I go and understand what I'm trying to say. And so before I even begin, I have to confess that this fear of being alone is so bad that I had to name my podcast the Community Podcast as a kind of spellcasting defense mechanism against the general fear that I'm going to be misunderstood and completely alone. So, that confession having been made, let us begin by examining what is a depth mystic. Now, this is a term that I had to make up to describe myself and the small number of people who adhere to the philosophy that I believe to be true. Would it make it any clearer if I said I was a Jungian depth mystic? Carl Jung is essentially the foremost depth mystic, just like the term depth psychology was adopted by the Jungians to distinguish it from other schools of psychology. Depth mysticism has been coined as a term to distinguish the mystic characteristics that I hold from other mystics. And there's a distinct Jungian slant to those characteristics. We can say that Carl Jung is the Yoda of depth mysticism. He is the most powerful and wisest depth mystic that we have. Now, the term depth mysticism didn't even exist in Carl Jung's time. So how did he end up being a depth mystic? You could call my school of thought the Jungian school of thought, or whatever Jung thought he was doing. It's basically modern mysticism that acknowledges that the religions of the Middle Ages are not fully satisfactory to modern needs. And that if we're going to have religion and mysticism in modern times, it's going to need to expand the scope of its thought, which is essentially what Carl Jung was an avatar of. He was expanding the scope of what's possible to think in terms of religion, even though he called his philosophy psychology, the study of the human mind. But even at its core, the study of the human mind requires a studier and a thing that is studied. The very mind that studies and is a prerequisite for any kind of ology or science is the thing that is supposedly studied by psychology. So we're already thwarting the hope that psychology can purport to be a totally objective science, just in the definition. If the mind is both the object and the subject of study, on what basis do we stand? You're just going to get lost. There's no objectivity here. We have to take a stand as an individual and say, this is what I think. Now, historically, mystics are the people who have foregone the pretense of objectivity in favor of simply declaring that they have experiences and insights that you don't. And at a certain point, there's no way to study psychology without making such a declaration. So essentially, any psychology, if you really look at it, has to be at least somewhat mystical. At its core, somebody just has to say, this is what I believe, and I'm saying it because I think I'm more insightful than you. So that's a basic defense of using the term mysticism as opposed to psychology. Psychology pretends to be a science, but it can never escape that there's a subjective element. And mysticism doesn't pretend. It says there's a definite subjectivity to what is being talked about. And I think that that's just generally true in the realm of Jungian psychology. If you haven't experienced the archetypes, you're not going to be able to talk about them very easily. This has always been the claim of mysticism, that there's something you have to see for yourself. Otherwise, you won't really understand it. But the term mystic is especially suited to me because I began my Jungian individuation process at an extremely young age. I was overwhelmed by what Jung calls the unconscious so early in my life that it became the dominant force before I could hook into society and establish myself as any other kind of ist, a therapist, a psychologist, or professor, PhD, or researcher, whatever else is normally available to people in society to attach to and establish themselves as legitimate as the result of, was essentially unavailable to me because I was overwhelmed by this mystical force. So how many other people qualify as depth mystics? To my knowledge, there's only one other living depth mystic. And of the people who are no longer living, I would count 7 people, probably, as qualifying for the term. I don't claim to have read every mystic or philosopher, but the number of people who, to my understanding, actually belong in this category is extremely small. And as indicated before, I couldn't even begin this podcast without declaring the existence of a community. That's how terrifying it is to be approaching the subject, realizing you may well be one of 2 people in the world who can understand a thing. And so there's a dual function to this podcast. One is to create and support a community for people like us. If you happen to be one of the 2 living people who qualifies for membership in this group. But also just to be a regular Depth Mystic podcast where it's basically devoted to giving expression to this mystical philosophy that I stumbled into, willingly embraced, but also found has virtually 0 people who really seem to understand it. So, let's talk about the theme song. You know, that theme song. The spirit of the theme song is the spirit of my mystical vision. It exudes the idea of rebirth. In Christianity, what does not normally appear to be good news, which is the crucifixion, but something that nobody would believe possible happened, which is that he resurrected himself from the dead. Well, it's like, okay, that's great if you can believe that. But the spirit of it was the most optimistic idea that we have in our Western civilization. You can be killed by society. You can be arrested and executed. But you can bring yourself back to life. There's some way of living again. And that's a cause for celebration. It's obviously a little bit depressing that society was so evil in the first place that it felt necessary to execute you. But at least there's some good news, which is presented as news so good that it totally outshines the negativity of the society that arrested and executed you. That doesn't even matter in Christianity. It's the fact that you can resurrect yourself that really matters. Anyway, I have a version of good news. My mystical experience did feel like a rebirth experience, a parallel to what's behind Christianity. I felt a mystical rebirth experience. But the philosophy and psychology behind my rebirth experience was not really Christian. It was something else. It was something that I later realized was rather new in the world and most closely corresponds to the things Carl Jung was saying. And so over time, I realized that I belong to a kind of new school of thought, a way of experiencing what in Christianity is the resurrection. I belong to a way of experiencing that is pretty modern, that, as far as I know, only started to exist in the 1800s and came to its full fruition in the life of Carl Jung. It's this other way of experiencing resurrection, you could say. I won't claim to have been physically dead, although many near-death experiencers do claim to have been physically dead. And unfortunately, I don't have the benefit of a large community the way Christianity presents people who experience rebirth. In fact, so few people have what I have. I had to invent a name for it and a community for it. But it is what saved me, as it were. So I had this resurrection experience, and it took me 21 years to integrate it, to come to some understanding of it. And now I'm back in society, kind of like Paul of Tarsus. And I have to give expression to what happened to me. So that's it for episode 1 of the Depth Mystic Community Podcast. Join me for episode 2, where we dive just a little bit deeper.